Okay, having a great chat with flutist Uwe Grodd in Auckland, New Zealand. Look at the weather. It is. I'm speaking to you on an Saturday afternoon in Santa Barbara, California, and it is Sunday late morning.
Sunday late morning, a little bit overcast, but otherwise it's a typical New Zealand winter. It starts with sun.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly right. But it's just so wonderful that we have these kind of wonderful communication capabilities in this age. All of its good, bad, and ugliness. There is this that we have speaking to each other from such great distances. We're going to speak about your 2019 Naxos CD release, all world premiere recordings of four flute concertos by Leopold Hoffmann. This is volume 3 of 3 recordings of Hoffmann's concertos. Hoffmann was a contemporary, really, of Haydn, Mozart. We'll discuss that area. Lived in Vienna, had a very successful career in Vienna, 1738, 1793. You see what I mean? From the 1760s on, right there in the thick of where all the action was, Vienna. I'll want to have you chat about that in a bit. The orchestra is a wonderful orchestra, the Czech Philharmonic Chamber Orchestra, Pardubice. I hope I'm getting close to the pronunciation.
Correct, yes, Pardubice.
Ah, I'm it's once in a blue moon. Now I'll get in trouble. Conducted by Mikhail Halash.
Excellent.
Okay, and this ensemble, the ensemble impresses me. So many Eastern European musicians are so wonderful. But also, this is the tiny little town.
It is
Pardubice.
it's about an hour and a half east of Prague.
Yeah.
Um, you get into a car, an hour and a half later, you're in this lovely little old town. And there's this wonderful orchestra who pretty much plays all week long, Monday to Friday kind of thing. And they have a fantastic atmosphere. They turn up to work like they all do in the former Eastern countries, and are so dedicated, so well prepared, and really give it their all for the time that you're there, completely focused and with great sort of gusto and energy. It's a fabulous environment.
Suddenly I want to move. Uh, but yeah, incredible. And this is a city, at least from my browsing on Google, 90,000 people, a yummy little tourist city, as I'm imagining, and so on, and yet produces this fabulous orchestra, wonderful small chamber orchestra, as we've mentioned, conducted by Michael Halash. And what I appreciate so much is that, as you mentioned, they rehearse clearly quite a lot. But the beautiful phrasing, the beautiful stylistic
Mm.
performances, beautiful intonation, all that good stuff. It's just really a first-rate
I think
orchestra.
obviously Michael Halas takes a lot of credit for that because he's got a very close connection with this orchestra, having produced quite a number of recordings with them in this period of music. I think his recent discs of the Cimarosa overtures is equally successful. But also we should mention the producer, Jiří Stilek, who is an incredible producer, a very knowledgeable man, very kind, very considerate and polite man, very, very professional in his approach, with extremely good ears and guidance, and very generous in his help and his commentary. And he shapes that orchestra, of course. They are very, very close. They're glued together, that orchestra and him, producing many, many CDs now for
Oh,
Maxis.
it's so exciting from an American perspective. Nothing really like that exists in the United States in terms of this sort of self-produced orchestras that get the work and chase their CDs and just have a life and so on. Anyways, first-class performances of these charming. I mean, I think that is my it keeps coming back over and over in these charming classic period concerti in D major, G major, A major, and G major. Well, again, we'll work on this, but first, just a little bit about Uwe Grodd. We just kind of run through it. First prize at the Cannes Classical Awards in 2000, Best 18th Century Orchestral
I,
Recording.
I keep I keep it on my windowsill
Oh, that.
here again because whenever I get a bit low in my practice energy, I look at it and it picks me up a little bit.
These props to re-inspire are very, very important. So well done and congratulations. And the Gramophone magazines twice Editor's Choice Awards. In other words, you're no dummy at making recordings yourself, may I say. I think I can say that unreservedly. You have this tremendous experience. International Record Review, Outstanding Industry Award. I mean, a graduate of the University of Mainz once upon a very distant time in my tiny youthful career, Mainz almost took me. But I think it's because I couldn't speak German very well when I was a young conductor. You know
Well,
how that is.
in those days, probably English wasn't spoken that much in Germany, whereas now
Yeah.
English is just so widely spoken, and you get even on the in the stations, and you get the announcements of the change of tracks or whatever, first in German, then in English. So the English is there everywhere now, but in those days probably
Eh,
didn't have it.
yeah, in those days, they had just invented electricity and other such. Anyway, you also are a conductor in terms of, I suppose, at the University of Auckland, you were doing conducting. Was that with the orchestra or chamber groups or what? Let's just chat about that because your teacher, let me throw this in quickly, was none other, among others, I'm sure, but none other than Sergio Celibidache, the fabulous, crazy, if I may say so,
So, yeah,
genius.
it's about right. He was a bit of an Übermensch, an Überconductor. He certainly put a stamp on all of us who were devoted to him, and in as much as that we wouldn't be recording for most of our 20s or 30s. We had to come out of that chilly like a cloud, if you like. It was not easy because once he took hold of your mind and your being, everything you thought only about one thing, and that was his philosophy, his way of thinking. You wanted to please him, you wanted to be inspired and near him, um, and he had a bit of a trick on us, and that was whenever he would sort of pause for a moment in the classes, he would then get you and say, "What is your question today?" And you had to ask him a question immediately. If you hesitated, he might not speak to you for the next 3 months. Um, and he once did this to me, and of course I forgot the question immediately, but I apparently came out with a decent question. And he ran across the whole room, it was about 30 or 40 of us, and hit me on my shoulder and said, you are not that stupid. It was a great
coming coming
compliment.
coming from this man, what an incredible compliment. And that's what I mean, I don't remember the details, but my little brief, among of course watching him as a conductor. I mean, to be terrified is to play for this man.
Terrifying and inspiring at the
At the
same
same time.
time. But certainly the great moments uh, when slow didn't mean too slow, the great moments were unsurpassed. There are moments in Bruckner 4 at the ending which I've never experienced anywhere like it again, um, where greatness is more than greatness. It's just you are accessing something maybe the composer wasn't able to even express on the page. But there were also these recordings which were terribly fast and weird and strange. And of course, he didn't control these recordings. He didn't sort of say, stop and we'll do it again. So therefore, it's really hard to judge him. However, I was in the lucky position that I experienced him for 3 summers, the only 3 summers he was in Mainz University as a guest professor. And then, of course, he had one of his usual kind of éclats, falling out with everybody, as he was famous for. But in those 3 years, which was exactly the period that I was studying there, I wasn't a private student of his, not at all, but one of those members that was hanging on to every word that he uttered.
And just a quick one, then we've got to speak about you and your flute and your career. But just another quick one. I have seen Celibidache in an interview with a young reporter, and the question was something sort of barely touching on the cosmic, something that all of us could understand. And he, with a twinkle in his eye, you could see that he thought to himself, I have one now. And he wrapped that poor young reporter into a pretzel as he very charmingly explained the universe and then some.
Absolutely, absolutely. That was his speciality. I mean, that was exactly what he could do at any time of given time and day.
Now let's talk a little bit about just a bit of background. It's always fun. What was the magic? You were 7, you were 6, somebody threw a flute at you. What?
No, I played the recorder like every good German schoolboy or schoolgirl does. In a good German family, you normally learn 2 instruments. My family was not that good. It wasn't that musically inclined because my parents didn't have anything to do with classical music. It was my uncle and my aunt who did. My aunt was an opera singer in Salzburg, and my uncle was the village musician in East Prussia, which is where is now Poland, of course. Um, And so there were some musical genes in the family. It was not completely foreign to my parents that I took to music, but all I had was a little recorder. And I loved this little thing, and I performed quite well on it, even some little solos in school and so forth, and it became my own little world. And then that, of course, extended to singing, and I had a rather special music teacher who had a fabulous choir that I joined, and during the Saturday afternoons in the local church, the service was usually at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, and every week we would sing another cantata. So we would rehearse it in the morning, pretty much like in the old days during Bach himself, and then sing it during the service at 5 or 6 o'clock. And you learn pretty quickly what to do as a voice soprano, and that became a wonderful thing. And then when my voice broke, so did my heart, of course, and I couldn't sing for a while. And so therefore the flute came along. I was inspired by a very fine flautist who was an amateur flautist, now a famous doctor, in fact, professor of medicine, in a little chapel in a little church. And he played a couple of pieces and some improvisations as well, that just took my heart away, just fascinated me, and that was the flute. Music itself was installed to me by an experience that came later of the St. John Passion under Helmut Rilling in Stuttgart. Stuttgart is my hometown where I was born, so I went to the Bach Academy there quite early as a sort of late teenager, maybe 15, 16, kind of unusual age to do this sort of thing. But went to the Bach Academy, and where every day was a different cantata, and then the big performances in the Stuttgart Liederhalle, the famous hall there, where Bach was, of course, for many, many years with the Stuttgart Radio Symphony Orchestra. There, Rilling would perform the Passions, and the Stiftskirche, where I was christened, in fact, was a particular performance of the St. John Passion, and I sat there at the end after Ruhet Wohl, the final chorale, and I was completely touched and moved. I couldn't speak, I was just weeping, and I didn't know what had happened. And at that moment in time, it was quite clear people had already gone out the cathedral and had left. It was quite clear at that moment in time for me that is what I want to do. I had absolutely no idea what I was letting myself in for. I had no idea how difficult this was going to be. I had no idea what lay ahead in terms of study or how to go about it, but I knew I wanted to do that. Of course, I had started so late in my life with flute. I must have been already 13 or 14. I've got kids playing the Bear Concerto at 14. That it was very, very difficult for me to then catch up technically. It was very, very hard, and not until my early 20s did I actually manage to catch up.
Let me jump in. You've mentioned a couple of things, or brought to my mind a couple of things. One is this magic that is our lives. Somehow, however it is that it enters our lives, those of us who are so privileged, really, to have had the experience, for example, you've just described, and all of us have our experiences that change us forever in art, just I'm sure in all other art forms, but music, it's so special because it's oral, goes right to the brain. And also you reminded me of what a colonial I am, describing just everyday life in Germany. You know, all the kids are at the Kirche, and they're doing a cantata every week. No big deal. And I'm thinking now, when I was a kid in Spokane, Washington. But there you go, the centuries of tradition, and no little wonder such great musicians.
There is something about that, and that is interesting because you're touching on the kind of the old world and the new world, which of course is very important for me, having moved to New Zealand in what I call New World. No connection with Washington. This new world here, which is of course already much, much longer in America, in the Americas, I should say. But the tradition in Central Europe around the church, and it often is around the church or the court, as in the case of Hoffmann, in the case of Hoffmann, you have both. You have the church and the court, because he was a church musician, but he wrote for the court as well. But that tradition is still very much alive. And I think that is something, when you go there, and I do regularly, well, not so much anymore now, of course, at the moment we're not traveling. but that is something that connects very deeply in you. And you as you mentioned the word magic, of course, when it chooses you, when the magic has chosen you through music, there is that other divine connection that we have, and that connects us all as human beings. And it doesn't really matter what background, race, or religion you are. It is a very close, deep human connection and human meeting place that we have through the medium of classical music. And there's nothing like it.
You know, and New Zealand, what an adventure, what a career for you. I'd love to have you spend just a couple of minutes discussing, since we have now discussed your training here in Germany and the life of Europeans in the arts as compared to New Zealand. What was that? What kind of culture shock was it when you first arrived in New Zealand, if I may ask?
Well, it was a culture shock. That's true. But at that time in the early 80s, New Zealand was the land of the unwritten page. You could write anything onto that page, and you could make it happen. And of course, coming from Germany, where you followed in the footsteps of all these wonderful, famous people, now you come to a country where you can do everything you want to do. If you want to build an orchestra, you can. If you want to put on this concert, you can. You want to go to the radio and record something, you can. And so there was the land of possibility. But at the time, I was purely a bit of a hippie with long hair and a backpack, traveling New Zealand, meeting an amazing amount of wonderful people. I remember we were walking out of Thames on the beach, maybe 100 meters away from the road. I was just walking along, and the car stopped, and two elderly ladies wound down their window and just called out, "Where are you going? Where are you off to?" And we said, "Oh, we're going to this town up north, Coromandel." Said, "Oh, it's a bloody long way. You better get in the car."
How
And
sweet.
so
How
we got
sweet.
in the car and we stayed with them for 2 or 3 days, and they showed us around for everything. It was an incredibly warm and loving country, and in many parts it still is. And I think we are very blessed, especially at the moment, with this care that New Zealand shows, including its
Yeah,
government.
yeah, yes, exactly. And we will mention it. There's no need to, but we are talking in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic. In the United States, things are not going well. In New Zealand, as everybody knows now, and everyone will know for all time, your government, your prime minister, right? She's a prime minister,
Yes, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern.
a woman
Yes, a
saved you.
young woman in her 30s.
Just
Um,
and had a baby recently. I mean, just incredible.
Maybe took the baby to the UN to make sure it still doesn't miss any feeding time.
Wonderful. Well, look, we must get to topic here. Let's have a look at these concerti. First, maybe why don't I ask you to give me a little bit of an overview about Leopold Hofmann. We mentioned his living in Vienna. I mean, he was privileged, I should think. I mean, can we say that his father was he was a diplomat or something? His dad, something like that. Give us that overview.
It wasn't his life wasn't that privileged, but what was very good for him was that his father owned a couple of vineyards, and that became quite a successful business. And when they sold the vineyards, and I can't remember when it happened during Leopold Hoffmann's life, um, that gave him a very good income, and that allowed him to be a composer. I wouldn't say freelance composer, because that was Mannheimer was the first really freelance composer during this time, but certainly he was able to take on commissions without having to feed a family or need for feed a family. But his most important job was at the St. Stephen's Cathedral. He was a church musician, meaning that you had to write the masses and all this kind of schedule of the church that the church has. And he was very, very successful. In fact, even so, today people probably don't know much about Hoffmann except for the Hoffmann scholar Alan Badley. But uh, he, on one occasion, the Emperor Joseph II attended the mass in disguise in order to hear a new Hoffmann Mass performed in St. Stephen. I think this is a lovely story. It shows how important he was at the time, that the emperor, who, by the way, also sent his daughters for lessons to Hoffmann, would come in disguise. I think that's just a lovely, lovely thing.
And this is the same Leopold II of Mozart's time, yeah?
Correct.
The same,
It's
same.
correct.
Too many notes, and yet in the case of
Exactly
Hoffman,
right.
he snuck in disguise to, and his daughters took lessons from Hoffman. So
Yeah,
but let's remember he was a violinist, so he played in the court. He was, as you've mentioned earlier, as well as church music. He was making a living in the big city, you know. Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. What fascinates me about composers like Hoffman is, and I have had the great fortune through Ataria Editions to record over 30 CDs of mostly unknown music,
Hmm.
now much more known. When I did my first, you mentioned Carnival, when I did my first volume of Van Hal symphonies, nobody apart from double bass players knew who Van Hal was.
Me
And now
too.
he's quite well known, because
Yeah.
now several volumes of symphonies are out, and some of his church music is out. But people like Hoffman and Van Hal, I compare it this way, or I'll explain it this way, is that when you look at a huge mountain range, such as the Himalayas, and you see Mount Everest, then that Mount Everest is, of course, awe-inspiring and stunning. Yet, it is not the only mountain that matters in this whole chain of mountains. And it looks so imposing and great because of all the other peaks around it. And at the time, of course, we're, we only actually know about 1% of the symphonies written during Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven's time, all up about 150. But we know there's more than 15,000 symphonies that were written during that time. So it's a tiny, tiny amount of knowledge that we try to gather from less than 1% of the material that's written. And therefore, I made it my quest to explore the other 99%. And it is like a treasure chest, I think you say, where you can find one thing after another, wherever you look, whether it's Cannabich or Dittersdorf having written quite an extensive article on Hoffman, by the way.
Mm. Oh,
And all these composers, it's just a wonderful journey
I
of
think
discovery.
my first student conducting experience as a young high school conductor was Dittersdorf. You know, some no
Uh,
doubt arrangement of one of his many zillions of symphonies. But the point,
123 symphonies.
and one wonders, I mean, how? I mean, you got to take time to watch CNN and pay attention and read the newspapers. What? I don't understand. Or listen to the radio. What? But also,
But the advantage was that many of those composers were not traveling unlike Mozart, and so
ah,
they were just at home with that orchestra, with that language, with the same harmonic kind of progressions and thinking in their minds, where they could turn out quite a lot of things quickly. So they didn't have to fight any stylistic influences. They could just write in their style once they found it and once they found their own voice, and then they could just write.
I've
And that,
never
of
heard that concept explained before. It makes things so much clearer, really. But also just the idea that we've had to kind of climb out of a heap of misunderstanding and prejudice. In other words, the Everest peak grabbed all of our attentions, and nobody paid any attention to these other guys. And again, to try and focus on Hoffman for a minute, just listening to these concertos, I've never heard these concertos before. I think I mentioned to you before we spoke, Leopold Hoffman, something about maybe one of those symphonies, you know, of his floated around somewhere. So he's not entirely unknown to me, but generally so. But his compositional technique, everything about all of these concerti, especially the last couple that I've told you, I think are really wonderful and marvelous, are beautifully composed, and
thank
just
you.
as well composed as
I
Haydn.
think I think they're absolutely wonderful and inspiring, and they're extremely well written for the flute. Often people refer to the instrumental works as being inspired to having been written for amateurs and so forth. But I can tell you from having practiced them that you'd have to be a pretty good amateur to be playing these things. Some of them are actually quite difficult. Um, of course, the simplicity of some of the slow movements, which is so lyrical and so beautiful,
Mhm.
and in many places romantic with the little letter, small letter R, not the capital letter R, but the small letter R, in emotion and in some kind.
Yeah.
Um, they are just gems, real gems. And he wasn't a flautist himself, but he was working closely with a flautist of the time called Apostelli, and he was able to obviously have close contact with the instrumental ability at the time. And interestingly enough, the flautists will know that the Mozart concertos only go to G in the third octave. The highest note of any concerto in the 18th century is a G. But Mr. Hoffmann goes to an A quite regularly without any problems. So he must have had some very hot flautist at the time, because on the six-hole flute of the old transverse flute of the period, and high A was pretty treacherous, and not a pretty sight either, I might say.
Oh, that's a great, wonderful anecdote, and also about the technology and the evolution of technology, instrument technology, and so on. What is now, and so on. Intonation and Baroque performance practice, and so on. I mean, all the difficulties that we watched, but also speaking of prejudices a little bit. I did not. Are we being invaded? What's going on? What my takeaway from these concertos, I think will be okay, is that they are so beautifully written. I kind of lost my train of thought here, but well, just that they're beautifully written.
Yes, they are. I mean, they're beautifully written for, as you touched on, for an instrument that was, in comparison to the contemporary modern flute that we know today, very challenging. I mean, the keys had to be what they are, which is why the A major concerto stands out in some ways, because of the key not being so easy on the flute at the time. They're usually in D and in G, because the flute was in D. The lowest note on the flute was a D on that finger, and then you had a D sharp key, an E flat D sharp key, and that was it. There were no other keys on the instrument. So everything had to be done in fork fingering, which limits the speed, which limits the ability to trill, to play chromatically, and so forth. And that's why the Böhm flute was invented with the Böhm system in 1833.
But let me jump in before I forget. Again, I just did it again. Something about the prejudice, which is that the inclination is, especially on first hearing, not me particularly, because I heard immediately something much, much more. But what I'm trying to say is, on first listening, they're so lovely. They're so beautifully put together. They're so salon, if you will, maybe. I mean, they're so courtly. You know what I'm saying? As in, oh, this is a man who sat down and cranked them out. Boom, boom, boom. And that's a bit of a prejudice, because that was my point. They're so beautifully constructed and so clever. I mean, there are some very clever little winks and nods and things. It's much, much more than just, crank it out salon music. That was, I think, the only point.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I think you're touching also on a question of interpretation of modern instruments playing music from this period. For me, it is a great privilege to be working with Baroque ensembles or 18th century bands, so to speak, using imitation instruments from that period or replicas from that period. That is a very exciting sound and can be very, very successful. But I play the modern flute, and I make no excuses for it, because I love it and I enjoy it. And playing this music these days, we are, of course, a lot more informed through the whole historic instrument movement over the last 30 or 40 years. And therefore, I feel it is quite a good time now for us to be playing this music, recording this music, because we're coming to it with an informed mind about stylistic interests and emphasis. And I was hoping to express this also in the cadences, the 11 cadences that I wrote for this recording myself, to be in a stylistic framework that is appropriate for the period.
You mean in terms of embellishment, your choice of embellishments and so on, in terms of stylistically, the way you as a soloist construct, yeah.
Style, use of vibrato, use of sforzati, crescendo, decrescendo, all these kind of devices, which on the modern instrument are often overdone for this type of music, or overstated, if you like.
And you are playing it on a modern instrument, not on an older instrument. Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to make sure that, because I've heard recordings of the older instruments, and it's very interesting. The colors, everything is fascinating. Yeah.
Fantastic. If done well, like Kuiken and so on, they play beautifully. I'm inspired by that.
So in the course of the past few minutes, you've answered about 4 questions. I just need to browse my notes and see what I've forgotten. I'm a little bit fascinated because Alan Badley has written such a beautiful program in your program book. It's just beautifully, solidly written. And apparently, is he the man who invented the system of organizing these works of Hoffman's?
He's the expert on Hoffmann. That's his doctorate was on Hoffmann. He spent many years living in Vienna, recording in the libraries with pen and paper in those days, the beginnings of movements of all these different works, of the whole sort of a group of composers we were talking about. And Hoffmann that's his baby. He loves his music, and he's the expert of it. He's writing currently the entry for the Denkmäler der deutschen Tonkunst. I don't know what it's called in English. It's the most important. It's the most important edition in Vienna of music of this period, and he is the expert writing for that. And he has published now, I think, well over 600 works for his company called Artaria Editions. Artaria was the publisher of Haydn, and that's where the name comes from.
Oh, really? Now, thank you very much for that. And it just come across it. I will put it up on your page, the Performing Arts Review. I hope better remind everybody that we'll put the video interview up at performingartsreview.net, and then I'll do the written review for you. I'm going to I'll also list the preceding 2 series. I'm not going to talk about having heard them, but just so people understand this series already. Let's got a little interference, satellites passing overhead, something like that. Tell me a little bit about you are in retirement. Yeah.
I'm in forced retirement. I'm not retired. What happened? I'm a professor emeritus from the University of Auckland. There has been a rather nasty restructure a couple of years ago, led by a couple of nasty people, and so
I'm sure they'll be delighted to hear that. Okay.
Yes, of course, and it was an unfortunate consequence that I took early retirement from the University of Auckland before I was restructured a few months later. But the recognition of the university, nevertheless, is still very gracious of making me Professor Emeritus, which is an importance.
And it gets dicey. I wouldn't have survived 2 years in academia. I would have been sacrificed within 2 years, I'm sure of that. What about I'm rushing up here to make sure of something. What about these orchestras? Tell me about your conducting career, please.
Oh, okay. The orchestras, you mean in New Zealand?
Yes, in New Zealand, yeah.
Okay. Well, in New Zealand is a relatively small country, as you will know, with just on 5 million people. So it only has one state-funded orchestra called the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, with whom I had the great pleasure and privilege recording a number of very fine recordings, including the Hummel Masses, previously unheard Hummel Masses. And then there are regional orchestras, and the best one of that is obviously here in Auckland, the largest city of New Zealand, called the Auckland Philharmonia Orchestra, an outstanding orchestra, now also recording for Naxos very regularly. Really beautiful orchestra. I've worked with them also on occasion. And then there are some other regional orchestras down in Christchurch and Dunedin. There's also a regional orchestra in Wellington. But they're called regional because they're drawing players and audiences from that region. They don't travel. Whereas the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra travels, as the name says, throughout New Zealand. And they have funding to do that. And thank God they have, because that way it maintains standards throughout the country, also including smaller cities, which is absolutely wonderful. Myself, I was part of founding the Manukau Symphony Orchestra some 26 years ago now. It's a very extraordinarily special orchestra based in the community south of South Auckland. And right from the beginning, I asked for maintaining a 3-pronged approach, which was professional leadership, community players, and youth. And to combine those 3 elements and get the best of everybody. And because of that, we're able to play fantastic programs, including the big symphonic works of Brahms and Bruckner and Mahler, and the usual wide range of concerto repertoire. and that is very rewarding. We meet about 5 times a year and have really great programs. Next one is coming. We had to, of course, cancel now during the lockdown, like I'm sure the rest of the world has. But now we're just starting up again, which is very exciting.
I may have misheard something. Do you do 5 concerts a year? What was the 5 concerts a year?
Five concerts. Yeah.
That's a pretty large and impressive repertoire to put together seasonally and forgive me, I don't want to offend, but by an amateur orchestra, an adult and student orchestra. Am I okay there?
Yes, absolutely. It is a community-based orchestra, but with professional leadership and professional organization. Gotcha. So that is why it works so well.
But 5 concerts, that's, to my mind,
yes.
Looking at community orchestras in the United States, 3, kind of 3 concerts a year sort of thing. So 5, really, you're pushing.
Well, the thing is that the orchestra grew with the audience and the audience with the orchestra as it got bigger and bigger and bigger. It started off as a disjointed group with very imbalanced orchestra, very imbalanced group, but it grew out of this wonderful spirit that it's maintained, and the audiences grew. So we now have regularly 400 to 500 people buying tickets without any advertising, well, not much anyway. And we can do contemporary music. We have commissioned many works. We're going to premiere a wonderful piece by Chris Ardley in November for a very large choir, a soprano solo and large orchestra. So there's some really exciting programs.
And there are some whose name immediately, one of whose names immediately leaves me, but New Zealand composers, orchestral symphony composer there in New Zealand, one of the big ones, big names. I love his symphonies, but the name is out of my head at the moment.
There are many great ones here, Gareth Farr and so on, that are really fabulous composers.
Yeah. And so where was I? Well, let's I think we'd better, we better wind it down. But somehow or other we didn't really speak a whole lot about these 4 concerti on this CD. I asked you earlier whether there might have been a little bit of chronology, because for my ear, just listening to took a whole slug of notes for the review. I thought maybe there might that the last couple of concerti are a little more late 1780s, 90s. You know what I mean? In other words, more the peak of his maturity. But I just don't know. What are your favorites? I have of the 4. I have the concerto in G as one of my favorites. Badly G1, and then what's the other one? Is the maybe just to kind of wind it down a little bit of time, but let's look at that one. Just this concerto in G, a wonderful key for flute.
Yeah. Fantastic.
It's the dotted rhythms. I just noticed in my notes. It's those wonderful.
That's a bit of a signature of him. This yum ba-dum ba-dum. He does that all the time.
I wondered because the last 2 certainly concertos are that wonderful. And I remember reading somewhere something about dotting a rhythm. Maybe it's something about Beethoven symphonies or something. But when you dot that rhythm, suddenly energy is boundless.
Yeah, it is, and it gives it a certain lightness. I referred to the article that Dittersdorf wrote on these flute concertos, and I'll quote from Alan Badley's writing.
Sure.
Because the article is quite. Where is it? Here we go. It's really very good. The way he says it is: Hoffmann, after Stamitz, is the only one to give the transverse flute the proper lightness and melody. I think it's a lovely way to describe these pieces, because it is the proper lightness, meaning it's a good composition, obviously, harmonically structured phrasing and all of that. But this yum ba-dum ba-dum ba-dum, this dotted lightness is just gorgeous, and the melody in the slow movements is so beguiling.
In all of the slow movements, the melodies are beguiling. And also, if we're talking about this dotted rhythm, that's what I noticed today listening, because the first concerto doesn't have that, as I recall. The first concerto is without it, and then the minute I started hearing those dotted rhythms again, this thing about something about Beethoven, the secret of getting things not only to be light, but to have vitality. They're just a simple dotting a rhythm gives music such vitality. And again, I think all the last 3 on this CD have this, as you said, this little signature of his with this kind of dotted rhythm. Yeah.
And plus then, of course, also the drive, the sort of running triplet passages and semiquavers and all that. And this guy, I can't say his name, Agostinelli, what's it? Agostinelli, is correct. He must have been amazing on the flute, absolutely amazing. The pieces were actually not written a long time apart. They were all sort of from 1775 to 1776. So whilst there is a kind of a different maturity to them, like the G major, the G1, they are from the same period.
Fascinating.
Altogether, there were 13 concertos. And so there's one missing, which is a double concerto for a little concertino for flute and harpsichord, which I would like to do in another disc, maybe paired with a one-half flute concerto.
Okay, you froze up just a bit. There you go. Now you're back. You froze just a little bit, but we could hear you, so we're fine. I think we've about exhausted it. What have I forgotten that you're dying to tell everyone about these concertos of Leopold Hoffmann? Well, you mentioned, it's very interesting to me, the fiddle player, singer, and he somehow gets this thing about flute concertos, and as you said, they're very, very well written. And you mentioned the flutist that he must have been right next to.
But I think that he was such a wonderful composer. It didn't really matter what genre he took. Mm-hmm. So that he wrote for, as you mentioned, violin, keyboard, flute, and so on. He wrote for many different concertos and many different chamber music. And I could mention also they've got some lovely duets for two flutes, and some solos for single flute and flute divertimento for flute and three strings. Many other works that are very delightful and a really, really fabulous composer.
So let's wind it down with exactly what you have just said. And we've discussed the beauty of all of these new recordings of work that no one's paid attention to in the past. All of this great repertoire that's readily now, much more readily available for people to learn, for musicians to learn, and so on. And in this case, we have Leopold Hoffmann and his 13 concertos. They're delicious, just delicious works of art. And you have mentioned that they're not easy, the flute parts, but they seem to me quite accessible, quite learnable. As you mentioned, that he knew what he was writing. He knew how to let the fingers fall. All right, well, we have just wound down a chat in New Zealand. We've got some kind of little interference going on with flutist Uwe Grodd outside of Auckland. His Naxos 2019 CD release, all world premiere recordings of 4 of the 13 concerti for flute, as I said, of Leopold Hoffmann. A man, his years are roughly 1738 to 1793, just to give everybody, especially professionals in the industry, an idea of this classicist, as right smack dab in the middle of that period. Viennese, wonderful music, a huge volume of music. Again, Czech Philharmonic Chamber Orchestra, Pardubice, sorry, I got in trouble. Mikhail Halash conducting. Uwe, thank you very, very, very much indeed for our finally getting together. It's only been a plague and a landslide and a couple of earthquakes separating us for the past several months. Good. Well, thanks, and we'll be in touch later.
Thank you for your time, Dan. It was lovely talking to you. Thank you very much for having me.
Bye-bye.